Entering into the 1960s, and after the decade where America's really on top of things in the 50s, and we have this bipolar world where the two superpowers control world policy, you're going to see a change of pace in the 1960s, and the United States gets new leadership in the form of John F. Kennedy. He wins the presidential election in 1960. When he takes over, though, he's almost immediately tested by the Soviet Union in a number of ways. And JFK, in his short time as president, is going to definitely leave a mark. The first thing we want to mention, though, is that Kennedy, being a very young president, he's only 42 years old when he takes office, he's going to have a lot to deal with. And one of the first things that he's going to have to encounter is the problem of communism in Cuba. As we mentioned last chapter, Cuba, which is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, they had fallen under the rule of Fidel Castro, a communist dictator who is right next to the United States, and he's very provocative, very much not a friend to America. And remember, President Eisenhower had been trying to figure out ways to deal with him. The CIA had plotted a number of instances where they wanted to assassinate Castro and they weren't able to pull it off. And so Kennedy has an idea. He wants to utilize the CIA in the same way that President Eisenhower had used the CIA in the 1960s. And so here's what he had in mind. The plan had kind of been handed off from the Eisenhower administration, where the CIA would take rebels, Cuban rebels, people who were not friendly to the communist government, and they would train them in another country. And then the CIA, after providing them weapons and military training, would drop them off at this little location you see on the map here called the Bay of Pigs. And at the Bay of Pigs, they would start a revolution against an uprising against Castro and his communist government. And they trained, is not a whole lot, something on the order of like 1,500 rebels. Now, these rebels, though, understood that as a small force, it would be really difficult for them to overtake the Cuban government. And so the United States promised them air support. If they have air power supporting them against the Cubans, then the Cuban government, Castro's army, has no chance. And here's what happens, though. Kennedy was a little nervous because he didn't want it to be found out or discovered that America is working on this plan, or that if they pull it off, they don't want the United States implicated in any way. They want it to look like Cubans did it on their own because they don't want to be seen as interfering. What happens is when they train these rebels and drop them off at the Bay of Pigs, at the last minute, President Kennedy decides to withdraw the air support, and this Bay of Pigs invasion goes terribly. Most people, historians now refer to it as a disaster or a fiasco. Any negative term you want to apply to it, that's what you could apply to the Bay of Pigs. These rebels, when they have no air support, they are captured. Many of them are killed or arrested. Some of them are later freed, but by and large, it's an embarrassment for the United States because the Cuban government and the rest of the world finds out, indeed, the United States and the CIA were behind this. It's a real black eye to the Kennedy administration. It's his first real test as president, and he fails that test. And so people are a bit frustrated with Kennedy. Okay? Now, same year, 1961, there's another test that Kennedy's going to get, and he handles this one a little bit better. One of the problems in Germany, remember, East Germany and West Germany had separated into two different countries, but Berlin, the entire city of Berlin, lay entirely within East Germany, and it was divided into East Berlin and West Berlin. The conditions in West Berlin were so much better than anywhere in East Berlin or East Germany, for that matter, that there was a massive immigration problem. People were crossing over into West Berlin to get away from communist rule. To correct this problem, the Soviet Union had East Germany put up a border construction, a literal wall. The Berlin Wall literally goes all around West Berlin. The idea was to keep people from East Germany crossing over into West Berlin. And so this massive wall, initially they just put up barbed wire and other blockades while they construct the actual wall. The wall goes up in 1961, and it's not going to come down until 1989. President Kennedy saw this as a unique problem. It's something that a lot of people feared would provoke war, but at the same time, Kennedy says to anything, let's just not do anything about this at all. For them, it's an embarrassment. By building the wall, they're practically admitting that their way of life, the communist way of life in East Germany, isn't working. They have to build a wall to literally keep people from going to West Berlin. So it's not about keeping people from West Berlin crossing over into East Germany. It's quite the opposite. People are literally dying to get in. The construction of the wall and everything around it, people were still trying to get in. People came up with very novel ways. One of the more popular methods, and sometimes dangerous, is a person and a partner would take a ladder and run towards the wall, put the ladder against the wall, climb up the ladder, and then jump over to the other side where they would try to prearrange somebody to meet them there and help them. Doing this could get you shot. During the Berlin Wall's history, we can't be certain, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 200 people died trying to get across. But in the grand scheme of things, President Kennedy handles this pretty well. He said, listen, the Soviet Union and the communists as a whole are embarrassing themselves. The next year, Kennedy's going to get another big test with what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis results from the fact that satellite imagery and intelligence revealed that the Soviet Union has placed intermediate range missiles, nuclear missiles, in Cuba, and they have the capability of reaching most places in the United States. And so now we have nuclear missiles pointed at us from a location just south of Florida where they could strike, the Soviet Union could strike, and we would have very little time for response. And this obviously is going to put people in a really bad way. President Kennedy knows he has to respond in a forceful fashion here. And what he does is sets up a blockade. They didn't call it a blockade because technically those were illegal. They called it a quarantine, which is really pretty much the same thing. You can see that the Soviet Union had set up missile sites in Cuba who was more than happy to antagonize the United States, especially after the Bay of Pigs problem. The blockade is with naval ships, U.S. naval ships, warships, and they warned the Soviet Union not to try to cross this blockade, that they would not tolerate bringing in any more nuclear missiles. And not only that, but they insisted the nuclear missiles be removed. And what happens is about a 2-week time frame where the world is on edge because the Soviet Union says they intend to deliver more nuclear warheads. They're sending ships across the Atlantic Ocean to Cuba, and people are going to be afraid of what happens when those ships get to the American blockade line. And you see basically a giant international game of chicken and who's going to blink first here. And while this 2-week time frame is going on, the United States and Soviet Union are working on some type of compromise, some type of deal. And thankfully, they do come up with a pretty good deal here. And Kennedy's going to look like a genius. What happens is the Soviet ships end up turning around just before they get to where the blockade was. And the agreement was the Soviet Union would remove all missiles from Cuba. And in exchange, the United States would remove the missiles it had in Turkey. Most people aren't aware that Turkey, the missiles we had in Turkey, the United States had planned on removing them anyway. But on top of that, the United States had to promise not to invade Cuba. And Kennedy makes that agreement. And people are happy with this. They look at President Kennedy and say, man, he was ready to go to war, and he rescues the United States. It makes Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union look really bad. All right, we'll talk about some other successes of President Kennedy and what leads to his untimely death in our next video.